All right, we're back. Next, to continue the conversation, I'd like to invite Senator John Thune from South Dakota onto the stage. Thank you. So Senator Thune, as pretty much everyone in the audience I'm sure knows, is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Communications, Technology, Innovation, and the Internet. You've long been a proponent of the effective and efficient use of spectrum, making sure that we are improving the underlying technology infrastructure, not only in cities, but across America. To kick us off, what grade would you give the US in terms of making sure that we have the infrastructure we need to build these cities?
Well, I think we're a solid B, but we could be an A. And we need to be an A. We have the technology to win the race to 5G, but there are some things that we can and need to do better if we're going to be competitive in that race. And everybody else around the world, Asia, Europe, everybody wants to get there first because of the enormous economic dividends that'll come with it. So
Sure.
some things we need to invest in.
What are those things that we should be investing in?
Well, I think that, obviously we've got, like you said, the technology, but we need spectrum. Spectrum availability is a huge issue. And infrastructure is a big part of that too. And it's a very different demand, infrastructure demand for 5G than what we've needed for fourth generation technology.
Do you think that more rural areas are being left out of the conversation and all the excitement and hype around cities and what to do in the most populated areas of the country?
I think most places that, obviously population centers have the volume that makes the build out, the investment pay off probably. Sure. So you probably see those places get it faster. What I hope to do is to be able to see rural areas benefit from that as well. And I think a lot of it will have to do with individual communities. And you've heard this morning from the mayor of Chattanooga. We have a new young mayor in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, who is very aggressively working to make sure that Sioux Falls and South Dakota is on the map when it comes to fifth generation technology, looking at ways to lower barriers and impediments to that type of investment, and seeking partners who will help join in that effort.
You were instrumental in getting the AV START Act on autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars as far as it got last Congress. It was so close, yet didn't quite get there.
It's so far away.
It's so far away. What can we expect this Congress?
We want to get that restarted, no pun intended, going again. And I think there's an opportunity there. Senator Gary Peters, who was my lead co-sponsor, was a bipartisan bill in the last Congress. I hope that we can release that again this year. We're in conversations right now with him and his staff about when to do that and what version to put out there. Obviously, we have a different dynamic now in the House than we did in the last session, so it'll be an evolutionary, I think, process. But I hope we can close the deal, because we really do need to have the sort of framework in place that puts the safety guardrails around the technology. But the technology is moving, and it's important for Congress and federal policymakers to keep up with it.
And speaking of keeping up with it, China has kind of a different government structure, obviously, and is ahead partly because it has the ability and willingness to invest in entire cities building around new technologies like autonomous vehicles. What advantage does that give them?
Well, I mean, I think that anytime you have state-owned enterprises and direction from on high to do certain things, I suppose there's some argument that gives them a little bit of an advantage. But I would argue that in the long run, a free market economy that's putting the right incentives in place will attract the investment and get a much better outcome in the long run. And whoever wins the race to 5G is going to benefit enormously economically from that. I mean, you're going to have the speeds 100 times faster, more responsiveness, more access, more connectivity. Those are all things that are benefits of 5G. So there are other countries around the world that are driving in that direction and have their governments pushing them, which is why, again, I think it's important here in the United States for us to at least be working to enable that. I mean, we don't have the top-down sometimes directives that other places around the world do. We have a bottom-up system, but we at least need to have a federal government that acts as a partner and is doing its part to ensure that that type of technology is given the opportunity to proceed.
And as we've talked about in the previous panels here today, there's been a lot of emphasis on deployment of 5G and just making sure it gets out as quickly as possible so cities and towns can, and everyone else can take advantage of it. companies are making that pitch too in their own business pitches. So T-Mobile and Sprint, for example, are saying in order for us to really win the race and make sure that we are deploying this technology as fast as possible, we need to merge and become one so we can be a stronger competitor. Do you think that that is do you buy that argument?
Well, there are certainly some synergies in that particular merger that I think make it make sense for those companies. I think you will see companies looking for partners to make all this happen. And we had a bill last year I introduced with Brian Schatz, a bipartisan approach called the Streamline Act, which was designed to help encourage investment in the necessary infrastructure to build out 5G networks and also to lower those barriers. And I'd like to get that legislation going again, although I will say that the FCC has taken some of those ideas and incorporated them in some of the policies that it's put forward. I mean, for example, having a shot clock that would limit the amount of time that a state or local government could consider an application for 5G, limiting sort of cost recovery to reasonable costs. There are some things there I think that we can be doing, so the bill looked at those. But I think that the companies that are going to invest in this are going to be looking for those cities and states that have a progressive view of how we get there and make it easier, not harder, to develop that. So like I said, City of Sioux Falls is really leading on that. Our municipal league in South Dakota has come up with a sort of standard ordinance that municipalities can adopt that, again, would enable investment and build out. I think we have to make it easier, not harder, when it comes to the role that governments play if we want to see this really develop quickly.
Are you concerned at all about the competition factor that this is a very technology-driven phenomenon with smart cities and making sure that technology is kind of infused into every part of our lives? Are you concerned that there's not enough companies involved in that?
I think that there's always the companies, of course, as they get bigger, and obviously they're in it to make money, to make a profit, and they're going to be looking for places where they can maximize that opportunity. It's always nice to have more competitors. In a state like South Dakota, we have a lot of rural telephone cooperatives and smaller companies that are making investments, and there are programs that are available that provide incentives for them to do that. We have a company called Golden West Telecom in western South Dakota, which is where I'm from. And they've done a great job, have figured out how to leverage some of the federal opportunities that are available, and they've built out a lot and are continuing to build out. And we want to incentivize that. If you look at rural areas of the country, you take, for example, a farmer in South Dakota, the use of precision agriculture, field sensors, remote monitoring, mobile devices, the ability to regulate how much fertilizer, water, seed, pesticides you apply to a particular tract of ground, and to maximize not only your yields, the bushels that you derive from that, but also to drive down your operating costs. The margins it's going to make it way more profitable. I mean, the productivity gains are going to be enormous in so many sectors of the economy. Agriculture, of course, being one that's important in our state, but telemedicine, telehealth, I mean, that has life-saving opportunities. You heard about smart cities and reducing congestion and the amount of pollutants we're putting into the environment. There are some enormous gains that are out there for us. But it is going to take a competitive free market approach to this, where everybody's in there trying to do their best to win the race.
What would you say is the single most important thing that the administration can do to help on this front?
Well, I think that the administration right now, and again, I would use the FCC as an example of that, and I met with the chairman yesterday, but I think they're taking a lot of the right steps. I think the administration realizes that this is an important priority. And if you're looking for areas that you can really create, tax and regulatory policy obviously being a couple of important examples that the administration has focused on previously, but this is one that has the potential to yield significant additions to economic growth and jobs. There are some studies out there that suggest that 5G is the $3 million or 3 million job potential creator, and hundreds of billions of dollars in additional economic growth. So I think that the administration, through the FCC, can lower these barriers, can make it easier for this investment to occur, try and make sure the federal government is a partner, not an inhibitor. And I think from what I've seen, they're taking the right steps in that direction.
How do you address the concerns of some cities given some of the things that the FCC is doing, that your bill you talked about earlier, trying to streamline the process to make it easier for private enterprises to work with the cities and get these technologies deployed. Some cities do feel like they're railroaded a bit. How do you respond to those complaints?
Well, I think that you have to approach it really as a partnership. And I know that the cities and local governments have pushed back a little bit. They don't want the federal government telling them what to do, and we certainly don't want to be in that position. You want to be respectful of the role that local governments have. I mean, they're important factors in their communities, and they want to make sure that this technology proceeds in a safe way. But I think you got to view it as a partnership. And I say that as somebody, I was the trade association executive in South Dakota for the cities and towns, so they're near and dear to my heart. But I think they have to look at it, and I think we have to look at it in terms of a partnership. And for the most part, that's happening. Like I said, in South Dakota, the Municipal League has developed a standard ordinance that cities can adopt that sort of deals with all the issues related to 5G infrastructure build out and investment. So I understand that tension, that friction. It exists on pretty much every issue that we deal with. It certainly exists on autonomous vehicles. We've dealt with a lot of it on that front. But if we're going to drive this process forward, it takes all of us getting behind the wheel to make that happen.
And when you're talking about digital infrastructure, the lifeblood of that is obviously data. And there's a lot of it, and it's growing exponentially. And the advent of smart cities and even autonomous vehicles is just going to increase that exponentially even more. What do you think about the privacy of that data? Do you think that there needs to be a national privacy legislation to address, or at least preemptively put in some guardrails?
I do, and we did a lot of work on that last year. Chairman Wicker, the chairman of the Commerce Committee this year, has made that a big priority. I think it's the potential to be a bipartisan accomplishment at a time when it will be hard to get bipartisan accomplishments. But the states are moving forward. Unless we want to have 50 states doing their own thing, I think the federal government needs to be heard from on this issue, but it's important. We've got to have a sort of a national, in my view, data privacy standard, data privacy law that we can put into effect to protect people's personal information.
Any ideas of what specifically would need to be done there? Any specific rule?
Well, I think a couple things. One is, obviously the preemption. I think you're going to need a national standard, which is going to be hard for some states. California has its own law going into effect next year, but if you're going to have a national standard, it's going to take federal law that preempts. And a lot of Democrats in exchange for that want greater regulatory authority at the FTC. There's a question of enforcement with the states and whether the states' attorneys general would have enforcement authority. So there are a couple of, 2 or 3 fairly significant, consequential, and somewhat thorny issues that have to be worked through. But in the end, I think we can get there. And honestly, I think we have to get there.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator Thune, for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah.